So earlier this week, Ukraine and the United States announced they had reached a deal on Ukraine's mineral reserves. Now, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, has made it very clear that getting a deal on Ukraine's minerals has been very essential for paying back the United States towards a path to peace. Ukraine has sort of pushed back on that. Zelensky's pushed back on that. But finally, after this talk, I assume they had over the weekend at Pope Francis' funeral, this was probably the final, cushioning or final socializing of the deal. They worked out details here, I'm assuming. And then obviously this deal was announced this week. Now, there was a deal that was signed actually in November of 2021, before the Russian invasion in that following February, that was essentially trying to accomplish the same thing, to try to wean the U.S. off of its adversaries for its mineral resources, especially as some of these rare earths become more important for battery technology. China's a huge supplier, Russia's a huge supplier, so making a deal with Ukraine, who also has strategic mineral reserves, is very important. So that's why that deal was signed in 2021. But then obviously the invasion happened, investors were scared away, no one wanted to get involved, the whole area was tossed in the conflict. And then to make matters even worse, a lot of the territory that Russia took over in the invasion is actually part of that reserve. About 40% of Ukraine's mineral reserves is actually currently occupied by Russia. So if they were to end the war today and say the boundaries are what they are now, 40% of Ukraine's reserves would technically be in what is now Russia. The deal that was just signed makes this very clear that this is only for mineral reserves going forward. So Ukraine hasn't even tapped into these resources yet. We don't even know what's there. We're just basing this off of preliminary findings and what we understand about geological data to suggest that there probably is this massive opportunity with minerals and Ukraine. So there's actually no guarantees at all that this will be successful. But anyway, I digress. In the past, and obviously you remember this sort of rambunctious and disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office a couple months ago, which did not go well at all. With Russia occupying a lot of Ukraine's territory, I agree with Trump that Ukraine really didn't have much to offer to Russia in the deal. Russia had already secured most of what they wanted, besides tossing the area into chaos. But at that time, Zelensky was like, well, we don't really want to concede that much. We want security guarantees. You're not giving us that. Trump was very adamant that you don't deserve that. You should be paying us back. So the U.S. wanted control over Ukraine's reserves, and much of the earlier deals that were proposed with regards to Ukraine's minerals were heavily focused on giving the U.S. control, if not straight out ownership, over Ukraine's mineral reserves for the billions of dollars of military aid that the U.S. has given the country. Now, in this most recent deal, and as a matter of fact, the United States is not going to have any ownership in this at all. In fact, it's going to be a strategic reconstruction investment fund that is going to be both co-managed by Ukraine and the United States, with Ukraine ultimately having the final say over whatever is done with their mineral reserves. If it's co-managed, but Ukraine gets all the profits, I'm not sure what's in it for the United States, because the United States is going to contribute directly to that fund, both for reconstruction and military aid. Military aid is part of the deal. I think just by signing the deal, the U.S. is giving Ukraine $50 million more in military equipment. So I don't know if it's just military aid that's specifically dedicated towards protecting their reserves, or what all the details are with that. That's sort of yet to be announced. But in terms of concessions, the U.S. really walked back a lot of what they were looking for. So they don't get to own anything. They don't get any profits. In fact, they're going to be contributing directly to the fund for reconstruction. All the profits for the first 10 years of this reconstruction fund are going to be reinvested into the fund. So if you're a U.S. company participating and you're providing your IP and your technology and your resources to do all the mining, all your profits, I guess, have to be reinvested. Or maybe it works some other arrangement. I'm not sure, but that's what it sounds like to me. There's no security guarantee, so the United States is not obligated to protect Ukraine under any circumstances as part of this deal. And there's also going to be a path to EU membership on the table, which I know Russia is strongly against. In fact, Russia's biggest reason for starting this war was that Ukraine was getting too friendly with the West. It was becoming too westernized. It was becoming too friendly with the Europeans. It was becoming too friendly with the United States. It had several democratic elections that it didn't like the results of over the course of multiple decades. And I know Putin is very obsessed with bringing the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine back to Russia, although I'm not sure how many people in Ukraine still speak Russian or actually are Russian. Don't quote me on that, how many there are, but Putin is committed to getting those people back into their homeland. I'm not sure how that would work or why that's a worthy pursuit, but Obviously, the mineral reserves are huge. I think that's not really discussed, but I think if Putin's got control of 40% of Ukraine's mineral reserves, that's a huge economic opportunity that's being swept out from underneath Ukraine's feet. I can understand Putin not wanting Ukraine to join the EU. I mean, the whole point of EU and NATO, I guess specifically he's more worried about NATO, but they've been talking about joining the EU as well. But in terms of joining NATO, I mean, the whole point of NATO was to oppose Russia in the Cold War. I can understand that Ukraine, who borders Russia, who once was part of the Soviet Union, by them doing a complete 180 and joining NATO, which is seeking out to protect Europe, really Europe, just Europe, from Russia. I mean, that's a hostile act. I mean, I can understand why Putin would not want that, and I think that's a reasonable compromise to say that Ukraine will not join NATO. I think that's reasonable, but at the start of the invasion, I mean, Russia wanted no NATO membership. They wanted no EU membership. They wanted Ukraine to vastly decrease the size of its military. They wanted a pro-Russia leader. So basically, they wanted to force a coup. And like, none of those things are reasonable. NATO, I can see that's reasonable. I don't even think Europeans should be in NATO. I don't even think NATO should exist anymore. The Cold War is over. So I think that's a reasonable compromise. But everything else on that list, not comparable. So I mentioned most of these already, but let me bring up my list here of notes I took from reading some of these articles. So yeah, this deal is vastly more favorable to Ukraine. In fact, I think the US gave up a lot of what it was looking for in this deal. For the biggest benefit to the US from signing a mineral deal is that even if the US gets minerals from Ukraine or not, I think by opening up Ukraine's mineral reserves, this is going to give everyone else in the world the opportunity to start buying this from Ukraine. And I think they mentioned this in the article as well, but I think part of this is also increasing Ukraine's role in the global supply chain for rare earths. I think that's another part of this that the US is going to contribute to, although how that is going to be done specifically, I have no idea. But I mean, getting dependence off of China and Russia for rare earths is going to be a big deal, and I think this is what this accomplishes, as I said. China's been taking advantage of the US from an intellectual property standpoint, from a trade standpoint, for a very long time. Russia has become increasingly hostile with regards to this Ukraine conflict. We don't know what's going to happen with Taiwan and the South China Sea. I get sort of like wanting to take these proactive measures, but at the same time, these proactive measures almost feel kind of hostile. I mean, I think it's a good thing that we're getting our dependence off of Russia, who is, like I said, increasingly hostile. China, who's been taking advantage of us, stealing our IP, taking advantage of us in trade for a very long time. It's a good thing, but it also feels like by doing these measures, it sort of feels hostile. It sort of feels like by being proactive or like trying to fight back, it's like sort of furthering the conflict. I'll say it that way. So I do kind of concern that there's like escalation between the two parties as part of this. And I really don't feel like comfortable with where our relations with these two countries are headed until we start to see concessions from the other side. Like China has said that, okay, U.S. is going to issue tariffs, we're going to issue tariffs back. I would imagine that if the U.S. does anything with Greenland, if that actually moves forward, that China would immediately pounce on Taiwan and take advantage of sort of that political opportunity. And then obviously Russia wants, like, one of the big things they want out of this war with Ukraine is that they want Crimea to be validated as Russian territory. They want validation from the rest of the world that Crimea is part of Russia. I mean, I don't think they're never going to get that, but I mean, how do you convince Russia to back off of that? I mean, I really think giving up NATO is going to be a huge part of this, but I don't know what else, I mean, Russia's going to want. I mean, they really have to bring concessions to the table to sort of end the conflict and de-escalate the heat that's been sort of pressurized on this situation. So, this is a great step. But where do we go from here? What does this mean for a peace deal between the two countries? Well, I think this was an important step, and I think this was necessary. This is a prerequisite to a peace deal. But like I said, it's going to depend upon how Russia reacts. They weren't at the table for this. Are they going to agree that Ukraine should have the rights to all these minerals and this whole reconstruction fund is going to do well? Or is Russia going to think that the U.S. is being too cozy with Ukraine? I don't know. As of now, there's been no development in talks. I know Marco Rubio said this week was a big step in the conflict, and this was prior to the signing of the military deal. So I think for now, we're just going to have to see what happens and see where this goes from here. But obviously, this is a big deal in foreign affairs. It's been going on for 3 years now, if you can imagine that. And it's kind of frustrating to see. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.